The Vietnam War was the second longest conflict in U.S. history, and undoubtedly one of the most controversial. The clash between the United States, along with the South Vietnamese government, and North Vietnam, along with the Viet Cong, stretched from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s, also impacting Laos and Cambodia. The roots of American involvement in Vietnam trace back to the tensions that arose between East and West after World War II. The U.S. entered the scene in 1950 by supporting France in its efforts to maintain its colonial rule in Vietnam. As the Cold War unfolded, the U.S. adopted a containment strategy to combat what it viewed as the expansion of communism. Assisting the French was seen as a means to contain communism in Southeast Asia. However, despite over $2.6 billion in U.S. military aid, the French eventually fell to the communist-led Viet Minh. The Geneva Conference in 1954 led to the temporary division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel, effectively creating two separate nations: Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and the non-communist state of Vietnam in the south under Emperor Bao Dai. This set the stage for the next phase of the war, where, for nearly the next decade, the U.S. backed Ngo Dinh Diem, who became prime minister after Bao Dai in 1955, following a questionable election. Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy supported Diem, hoping he and a non-communist Vietnam would counterbalance the communist North. Yet, Diem's corrupt and unpopular government struggled to manage the growing insurgency in the South after he declined to hold elections in 1956, as stipulated by the Geneva Accords. The U.S. stood behind Diem in this choice, working hard to strengthen South Vietnamese forces to combat the insurgency. Diem initiated a military campaign against the remaining Viet Minh elements in the South. Meanwhile, the Communist Party in Hanoi, focused on rebuilding the war-ravaged North, initially preferred a political strategy over military action in the South, hoping to destabilize Diem's regime through increased internal political pressure. In 1957, fighting erupted when Diem deployed his troops to target communist strongholds. Throughout that year and into 1958, Diem's forces achieved considerable success, killing or capturing many suspected communists. With political strategies failing to topple Diem's government, the Central Party Committee in Hanoi made a pivotal decision. At the 15th Party Plenum in January 1959, they approved a secret resolution to employ revolutionary violence alongside their political efforts, both aimed at overthrowing the Southern government. Hanoi began sending equipment and personnel southward along what would become the Ho Chi Minh Trail to join the fight. Fragmentary acts of violence evolved into a more sustained campaign, aided by Northerners who had infiltrated South Vietnam, taking leadership roles in the growing insurgency. To orchestrate this initiative, the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, or NLF, was formed on December 20, 1960. The NLF was a typical United Front organization that included non-communist nationalists who joined forces to defeat the U.S.-backed Diem regime in Saigon. Although there were claims to the contrary during the war, Hanoi later acknowledged its control over the NLF and its direction of nearly every aspect of the conflict in the South. In 1961, recognizing the insurgency's swift expansion, and based on insights from a team sent to Vietnam to evaluate conditions and future American aid needs, President John F. Kennedy opted to boost U.S. support for the Diem regime by signing a military and economic aid treaty with the Republic of Vietnam. That year saw the delivery of around $65 million in military equipment and $136 million in economic assistance. By the end of 1961, the number of U.S. military advisors surged to more than 3,200. These advisors, who had previously engaged only in training and senior staff roles, began to advise South Vietnamese ground combat units directly in the field at the battalion and regimental levels. To streamline all U.S. military support activities in South Vietnam, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, or MACV, was established in Saigon in 1962. As the insurgency intensified, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam struggled increasingly to manage the escalating threat. By this stage in the war, all communist armed groups in the South had come together to form a single entity known as the People's Liberation Armed Force, or PLF, in 1961. This force, more commonly referred to as the Viet Cong, a term used derisively to describe Vietnamese communists, consisted of about 15,000 fighters. Their numbers would soon swell as increasing numbers of North Vietnamese soldiers poured down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to join the struggle in the south. By the close of 1962, the National Liberation Front, which included both political and armed components, had surged to an estimated 300,000 members. On the other hand, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, faced serious internal issues, including widespread corruption and ineffective leadership, which rendered them largely powerless against the ever-expanding insurgency. This became painfully clear during the Battle of Ap Bac on January 2, 1963. Although the ARVN touted it as a significant victory simply because the Viet Cong abandoned the battlefield, the reality was that a small VC force decisively defeated a much larger contingent from the 7th ARVN Division before retreating in good order. While Diem's military struggled to tackle the insurgents, his regime, headed by a Catholic, lost popularity as he resorted to increasingly repressive tactics to suppress dissent in South Vietnamese society. Diem's brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, who led the secret police, saw militant Buddhists as a key threat. Accusing them of aiding communists and supporting anti-Diem movements, Nhu initiated a crackdown on Buddhists to bring them under control. Tensions escalated in May 1963 when ARVN troops opened fire on Buddhist protesters in Hue who were rallying against Diem's discriminatory practices. This was followed by a shocking event in June when a Buddhist monk self-immolated at a busy intersection in Saigon, grabbing global headlines and causing significant alarm in Washington. When Nhu dispatched special forces to several Buddhist monasteries, leading to the deaths of monks and the arrest of many others, it ignited a wave of student protests in Hue and Saigon, resulting in the detention of 4,000 students by government troops. The communists seized this moment to stoke anti-Diem sentiment, further destabilizing the political landscape. In the end, the Kennedy administration lost confidence in Diem and quietly approved a coup organized by a faction of South Vietnamese generals. This coup unfolded in early November 1963 and resulted in the assassination of Diem and his brother. Just weeks later, President Kennedy was assassinated and Lyndon Baines Johnson assumed the presidency, facing a deteriorating situation in Vietnam where the war was faltering for the South Vietnamese and their 16,000 American advisors. In Saigon, the coup led to General Duong Van Minh seizing control, ushering in a chaotic year marked by multiple coups and rising instability. By mid-1964, the Viet Cong forces in the South, now numbering 35,000 guerrillas and 80,000 irregular troops, were frequently defeating the Army of the Republic of Vietnam in battle. President Johnson found himself in a difficult position. He couldn't appear soft on communism in Vietnam, yet he was wary of escalating the conflict and potentially drawing in China, as had occurred in Korea. He also feared that an expanded war effort might provoke a domestic backlash threatening his Great Society welfare initiatives. Aiming to limit the war, he wanted to send a strong message to Ho Chi Minh and the other leaders in Hanoi to refrain from intensifying the conflict in the South. Johnson's chance came on August 2, 1964, when North Vietnamese patrol boats fired on the U.S. destroyer Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin. After claiming a second attack took place on August 4, a statement later shown to be false, he sought a congressional resolution to authorize a response. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution passed with just 2 dissenting votes, granting the president the authority to take all necessary measures to repel attacks and prevent further aggression. This resolution essentially gave the president full power for large-scale U.S. intervention in the Vietnam War. In response to the Tonkin Gulf incident, Johnson ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam. Meanwhile, Hanoi began deploying regular North Vietnamese Army units down the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos to support the insurgents in the south. Until then, North Vietnamese troops had primarily bolstered the Viet Cong ranks. The entry of main force NVA units changed the dynamics of the conflict. Units on the battlefield in the south marked a significant shift in the war's dynamics. The ARVN struggled to combat the insurgency and now faced a fresh assault from regular troops sent by the North. In the latter part of 1964, the Communists intensified their attacks, targeting Bien Hoa Air Base, bombing an American officer's quarters in Saigon, assaulting the ARVN in Tay Ninh province near the Cambodian border, and seizing most of Binh Dinh province along the north-central coast. In January 1965, when the VC attacked the U.S. base at Pleiku, President Johnson once more ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam. At this point, the president and his advisors recognized that American intervention was essential to prevent the collapse of the Saigon government. Johnson, intent on keeping the conflict limited and aiming to communicate his message to Hanoi, initiated a sustained bombing campaign against targets in North Vietnam, known as Operation Rolling Thunder. This operation, which Johnson believed would compel Ho and his advisors to abandon the fight in the South, started in February 1965 and would fluctuate over the next 3 years. It faced obstacles due to restrictions from the White House and a complex command structure. Ultimately, it became one of the least effective air campaigns in history. Meanwhile, the ARVN struggled under the relentless communist attacks. Aside from their combat shortcomings, the South Vietnamese forces dealt with rampant corruption and desertion. By the end of 1965, 113,000 ARVN soldiers would have deserted their ranks. In March 1965, as the ARVN neared collapse, U.S. involvement escalated when Johnson began dispatching American ground combat troops to Vietnam. These troops were officially there to secure American airfields in South Vietnam. The first 2 U.S. Marine battalions arrived near Da Nang and began defensive operations around the large U.S. base there. General William Westmoreland, commander of MAC-V, believed the VC were preparing for a significant offensive and felt the South Vietnamese couldn't cope with this new intensity of fighting, prompting him to request more American troops. The Joint Chiefs of Staff concurred and began sending additional forces, aiming for American units to protect U.S. military enclaves. Under this plan, American troops were supposed to operate within a 50-mile radius of their bases. However, as more units arrived, they quickly shifted from defensive tactics to offensive actions. The initial Marine battalions were followed by 7 U.S. Army divisions, 2 Marine divisions, and 4 independent Army brigade-sized units. By the end of 1965, there were 180,000 U.S. ground troops in South Vietnam, and by mid-1966, that number grew to 350,000. General Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces, initiated a series of large-scale search and destroy missions to find and eliminate the enemy. Meanwhile, the Communist forces, guided by Hanoi, prepared for a long and grueling conflict aimed at wearing down American resolve. This led to a devastating war of attrition, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. The Vietnam War created deep divisions back home in the United States and fed into the social turmoil of the 1960s. The lack of meaningful progress against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, the rise of anti-establishment counterculture, vivid media coverage of the combat, and the growing credibility gap between the government and the American people severely weakened support for the war. By late 1967, there were nearly 500,000 American troops in South Vietnam, and while U.S. forces had inflicted significant damage on the Communists, fierce fighting continued throughout the country. President Johnson launched a public relations campaign to highlight any progress being made in an effort to gain public backing for his administration's war strategy. Amidst this campaign, the Communists executed a large-scale offensive during the Tet New Year holiday in 1968. Though this offensive resulted in a tactical defeat for the Communists, the shock and scale of their attacks left the American public reeling and led a disheartened Johnson to decide against running for re-election. The Tet Offensive became a powerful psychological victory that altered the nature of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, paving the way for the next phase of the war and eventually leading to the withdrawal of all American forces, though that would take an additional 4 years. Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, largely because he vowed to end the war and achieve peace with honor. To fulfill this promise, he announced he planned to Vietnamize the war, shifting American goals from outright victory to a gradual withdrawal of troops, passing the responsibility for combat onto South Vietnam. Throughout this transition, the fighting continued. Neither the extensive bombing of South Vietnam and North Vietnam, nor the escalation of the conflict into Cambodia and Laos brought any resolution. Frustrated by the bloody stalemate, North Vietnam initiated a full-scale invasion of the South in the spring of 1972. Initially, they made significant gains, but eventually, they were pushed back by overwhelming American air support. In the aftermath of this offensive, Nixon declared Vietnamization a success. At the same time, Henry Kissinger was engaged in covert peace talks with communist leaders in Paris. By October 1972, Kissinger and North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho had crafted a tentative peace deal. However, South Vietnam's President Nguyen Van Thieu fiercely opposed the terms and called for 69 amendments. In response, the North Vietnamese ended the negotiations. Nixon then ordered an extensive bombing campaign targeting Hanoi and Haiphong. After 18 days, the North Vietnamese agreed to return to the discussion, but the agreement they reached was not significantly different from the earlier one in October. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. The agreement included a ceasefire and outlined the withdrawal of all U.S. troops by March 1973. There was no reference to the North Vietnamese forces still present in South Vietnam when the ceasefire began, but Nixon assured Thieu that the United States would support South Vietnam should Hanoi break the ceasefire terms. While the signing of the accords marked the end of America's involvement in the war, it ushered in a new chapter for the Vietnamese. Nixon kept reassuring President Thieu, but he faced increasing challenges from the Watergate scandal. By early August 1974, Nixon resigned, and Congress subsequently cut military aid to Vietnam. In December 1974, Hanoi launched a final offensive in the south, with South Vietnamese forces retreating in chaos as North Vietnamese troops advanced steadily southward. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled in. Through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, South Vietnam surrendered without conditions. Even though U.S. forces, who had not faced defeat on the battlefield, had exited 2 years prior to the fall of Saigon, this North Vietnamese victory marked the first time the United States had experienced a loss in war. Over 58,000 Americans died, and more than 300,000 were injured. South Vietnam fell to communist control, leading to a deep division within American society and prompting citizens to question the truthfulness of their own government. The impacts of this war would resonate for many years to come. Modern counterinsurgency theory highlights the importance of establishing a legitimate government that can meet the basic needs of its people. To achieve this, the host nation must defeat the insurgents or make them irrelevant, maintain the rule of law, and ensure a minimum level of essential services and security for its citizens. A vital component of all these responsibilities is the creation of an effective security force within the host nation. In the United States, we refer to the need for capable local forces as a blinding glimpse of the obvious. However, just because this need is clear does not make it easy to fulfill. This reality became increasingly evident as U.S. forces in Vietnam engaged more deeply in training the South Vietnamese army to confront the growing insurgency that emerged in the late 1950s. The U.S. training mission in Vietnam can be seen as unfolding in 5 loosely defined phases. It started with American support for the French during the First Indochina War and concluded with the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces after the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. In the early stages of the First Indochina War, American involvement was minimal. However, beginning in 1950, as senior U.S. policymakers began to view the war as a struggle against the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, American engagement gradually increased. The first members of the Military Assistance Advisory Group, Indochina, MAGI, arrived in Saigon in September 1950, but during this early phase of U.S. involvement, there was limited American participation in training Vietnamese forces. Initial efforts focused more on supplying military aid to the French, primarily through the transfer of weapons, munitions, and other materials. By 1954, the United States was covering 80% of the French war effort in Indochina, contributing over $2.6 billion in military aid between 1950 and 1954. Following their defeat at Dien Bien Phu that same year and the signing of the Geneva Accords, the French started a 2-year withdrawal from Vietnam. This time marked a second phase of the U.S. training mission, where Americans and French worked in concert to strengthen the South Vietnamese armed forces. With the French exit approaching, President Dwight D. Eisenhower decided the U.S. would take on the challenging task of building a South Vietnamese military capable of confronting the communist insurgency. Army Chief of Staff Matthew Ridgway cautioned that this effort could be hopeless without a strong, stable civil government in place. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles disagreed, claiming that one of the best ways to empower the Vietnamese government was by reorganizing and training their national army. Ultimately, Dulles prevailed in that debate, but Ridgway's warning would turn out to be insightful. The primary issue was that the Saigon regime, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, suffered from corruption, nepotism, and inefficiency, compounded by deep social, ethnic, and religious divides in the countryside. These problems would considerably hinder efforts to develop and train an effective South Vietnamese military force. With Eisenhower deciding to proceed with the training mission in Vietnam, Ridgway and the other Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed, and the initiative to advise and assist the Vietnamese government in military training began to gain traction. In February 1955, the Training Relations and Instruction Mission was set up in Saigon. Initially a joint Franco-American effort, TRIM was established to develop and train the South Vietnamese Army. By November of that year, the Military Advisory Assistance Group, Vietnam, or EMA, replaced MAC-I. By early 1956, the departing French had effectively turned over the mission of building the South Vietnamese armed forces to the Americans. With the French withdrawal, the third phase of the U.S. training effort commenced. The goal of the American initiative during this time was to establish a comprehensive security framework in South Vietnam, built on 3 main pillars. At the foundation lay the Self-Defense Corps, a part-time militia formed by local villagers to protect themselves from guerrilla attacks. Above that, there was the Civil Guard, a company-sized militia specifically organized at the provincial level to ensure regional security and maintain order. At the top of this structure stood the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN. ARVN was created from the remnants of the Vietnamese National Army, which the French had established in 1950, from units that acted as local support for the French Union forces in their struggle against the Viet Minh. The U.S. training advisors faced a significant challenge: how to mold the VNA into a formidable force capable of defending the nascent Republic of Vietnam against a rising insurgency. The VNA was burdened with serious issues. For one, many South Vietnamese viewed it negatively due to its association with the French colonial forces. Furthermore, the VNA was mainly structured into small units focused on non-combat roles. It lacked experienced senior leadership, and the existing high-ranking officers were often caught up in political disputes. To complicate matters, the VNA was also plagued by corruption. By 1954, the VNA had around 150,000 personnel, but was struggling with desertions and defections, and one U.S. report noted a complete breakdown of combat capabilities. This shaky foundation would become the starting point for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The first priority was to help recover American equipment that had been given to French and Vietnamese forces, as well as to develop a robust logistics capability to support the new South Vietnamese Army. To achieve this, the Temporary Equipment Recovery Mission, known as TERM, was established in February 1956. This organization, working under MAV, would not only concentrate on logistics, but also provide a pool of personnel to serve as trainers and advisors. Initially, the pressing question in forming the new Army of the Republic of Vietnam was, what type of army should this be? In the early days of the U.S. training mission in Vietnam, there was some focus on preparing South Vietnamese forces for civic engagement and pacification. However, as the insurgency gained strength, the emphasis shifted away from the unique aspects of counter-guerrilla warfare. Instead, the priority became preparing the forces for the most pressing threats, guerrilla main force units and potential invasions from North Vietnam. The Military Assistance Advisory Group drew significant lessons from the U.S. experience in South Korea, where a conventional invasion by North Korean forces nearly led to the collapse of the Republic of Korea. Consequently, the American training effort concentrated on developing a South Vietnamese military that mirrored U.S. Army light infantry divisions, expected to manage both internal security and withstand a North Vietnamese invasion. The training relied heavily on U.S. tactical doctrine, effectively aiming to mold the Army of the Republic of Vietnam to resemble the U.S. Army. It can be argued that in the initial stages of this mission, a focus on counter-guerrilla tactics might have been more successful against the emerging insurgency. Ultimately, though, the ARVN was organized and trained to confront an external threat from the People's Army of Vietnam, rather than the actual conflict with the National Liberation Front. By 1959, there was an acknowledgement that internal subversion and the externally supported insurgency posed the most immediate dangers. But this realization came too late to shift the American approach to training South Vietnamese forces, which continued to focus on establishing and maintaining a conventional military force. At that point, after over 200 revisions to the organization and equipment structures, the goal for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam became 7 standard divisions, each consisting of 10,450 personnel organized into 3 Army Corps. Beyond organizational matters, a more pressing concern was training the troops who would serve in these units. By the end of 1959, a South Vietnamese Army service school and training infrastructure had been created, featuring 18 schools and training centers dedicated to basic and specialized training for individuals. These schools and centers trained about 20,000 soldiers each year. Additionally, a strong offshore program was created to provide specialized training for key officers and enlisted personnel at select U.S. schools both in the States and overseas. While the U.S. training mission succeeded in meeting individual training needs, collective and unit training faced significant challenges. The Americans struggled to persuade the South Vietnamese military leaders of the importance of collective training. Many of these leaders were political appointees who believed their careers hinged more on political connections than on military effectiveness. As a result, they were more engrossed in political maneuvering than in dedicating time and effort to build a strong military force. Meanwhile, the insurgency was on the rise. With the growing demands of the conflict against insurgents, South Vietnamese forces often lacked the time and personnel for collective training. The urgent operational requirements made it difficult to implement effective training exercises for units that were already established, as most of the troops were engaged in the field. Some attempts were made to free up South Vietnamese forces for training by leaning on paramilitary groups to take on more local security responsibilities. However, the U.S. effort in Vietnam suffered from a notable lack of unified command, leaving the military with little influence over police and paramilitary forces, which were under American civilian advisors. When these forces were unable to provide security in rural areas, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam had to step in, further hampering its training and professional growth, making it less effective against the Viet Cong. In addition to trying to train South Vietnamese forces while they were in combat, the U.S. training mission faced numerous other significant hurdles, including a shortage of effective American advisors. These advisors had a tough task, working alongside the South Vietnamese to help enhance their combat capabilities. Eventually, U.S. advisors were assigned down to the battalion level, taking on the responsibility of training and coordinating efforts, staff operations, setting up a logistics system, and aiding in operational planning. Initially, U.S. advisors were not allowed to accompany ARVN forces during combat operations, but this rule was relaxed in mid-1961 as the insurgency gained strength. Besides those stationed at the main headquarters and operational divisions, there were also advisors assigned to the South Vietnamese Army Service School and Training Program. Additionally, more advisors participated in district-level pacification efforts, while Special Forces teams rotated in and out of South Vietnam to work on mobile training teams for selected South Vietnamese units, and to collaborate with the Montagnards under the CIA-supported Civilian Irregular Defense Groups program. To oversee the advisory efforts and handle the growing U.S. training mission, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, was established on February 8, 1962. However, despite this new command and an increase in training advisors, the mission faced significant challenges. It remained difficult to find enough qualified American military personnel to serve as advisors and trainers. Many chosen for these roles had little or no combat experience, and very few had any real experience in counter-guerrilla training. It was also rare for them to speak Vietnamese or understand Vietnamese culture, leaving many ill-prepared for such demanding duties, which severely limited the overall effectiveness of the advisory mission. In addition to these challenges, one of the biggest barriers to enhancing the training of the South Vietnamese Armed Forces was the lack of qualified leadership within ARVN at all levels, both among officers and non-commissioned officers. This issue stemmed from the rapid growth of the South Vietnamese military, which lacked a strong foundation of experienced leaders to build upon. As the Americans worked to boost the combat capabilities of the South Vietnamese forces, the other side was also making its own plans. Once Hanoi understood that South Vietnamese Premier Ngo Dinh Diem was not going to hold the elections promised in the 1954 Geneva Accords, they began strategizing accordingly. Accords, Ho Chi Minh and his associates opted for military action to achieve a unified Vietnam under communist rule. By the decade's end, the size and strength of the insurgency in the South, supported externally, had dramatically increased. Despite enhanced advisory efforts, by 1963, South Vietnam faced serious military and political issues. The South Vietnamese military frequently faced defeat on the battlefield, while the Diem regime struggled with inefficiency and oppressive tactics. A prime illustration of this was the Battle of Ap Bac in January 1963, where a smaller, outgunned Viet Cong unit delivered a shocking defeat to the 7th ARVN Division. This was just one in a long line of setbacks for South Vietnamese forces. The situation escalated in November 1963, when several of Diem's generals executed a coup on November 1st, resulting in the assassination of Diem and his brother. Just 3 weeks later, President Kennedy was assassinated as well. During Kennedy's administration, the number of U.S. personnel in Vietnam swelled to over 160,000, but escalating political chaos severely weakened the effectiveness of South Vietnamese forces, leading to minimal progress against the insurgency. In Washington, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, pledged to maintain the course in Vietnam set by his predecessor. However, he faced two significant challenges: addressing an externally supported insurgency and countering what was evolving into an invasion by conventional forces from North Vietnam traveling down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to join the fight in the south. By this time, it was evident that U.S. aid and advice had not succeeded in creating an effective fighting force within the South Vietnamese armed forces. The survival of the South Vietnamese government was critically at risk, which ultimately led to the significant deployment of U.S. combat troops to stabilize the situation and prevent the complete military defeat of the Republic of Vietnam. Under the 1964 Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which granted the president the authority to take whatever actions he deemed necessary to address the situation in Vietnam, Johnson aimed to use air power to persuade the North to abandon its objectives in the South. Little impact, leading Johnson to eventually send in U.S. ground troops. The first group of Marines arrived under the guise of protecting U.S. airfields, but they soon engaged in offensive combat against the VC and PVVN. Rapidly, more U.S. ground forces were deployed, and by 1967, there were over 400,000 troops in Vietnam. As the American presence expanded, General William C. Westmoreland, the senior U.S. commander in Saigon, directed these forces to locate and eliminate enemy main force units, resulting in a brutal war of attrition. With the introduction of U.S. ground troops, a new phase began for the U.S. advisory effort. During this time, MACV shifted its focus from advising and strengthening South Vietnamese forces to military operations by conventional American troops against the VC and PAN. The ARVN were largely sidelined, tasked primarily with pacification and ensuring the safety of civilians. By 1966, the buildup had overshadowed what was once a mere advisory show, with training taking a back seat to military operations. Historian Jeffrey J. Clark noted that advisory efforts aimed at training South Vietnamese forces effectively became supplementary to the operations of larger American ground combat units almost everywhere. American advisors persisted in their roles. However, the decreased focus on advisory tasks led to a lack of resources for training. Prioritization in terms of personnel favored U.S. combat units rather than the advisory teams. This resulted in advisor teams being often understaffed and comprised of individuals who did not meet the necessary criteria for their roles. By 1968, MAP-V was about 2,500 advisors short of its authorized strength. In this context, being available for an overseas tour often became the main criterion for assignment, with little to no vetting process. The general belief was that any Army officer could serve as an advisor. Many who were selected for this role received minimal specialized training in the governance, politics, or recent history of South Vietnam. Though most advisors made a concerted effort to meet their objectives, they faced numerous obstacles. They encountered challenges that tested their resolve. Navigating an unfamiliar culture, the advisors had few guidelines to follow. As one advisor noted later in the conflict, Americans and South Vietnamese operated in completely different realms. The linguistic and cultural divide between us made it nearly impossible for an advisor to bridge that gap. It quickly became clear that the U.S. advisory program faced deeper systemic issues. Along with previously mentioned concerns, the typical 12-month advisor assignments, often translating to even shorter durations spent actually working alongside South Vietnamese counterparts, led to a revolving door effect that created instability and hampered the development of trust. This lack of continuity stifled the growth of the advised units. Short assignment lengths left advisors with little motivation or resources to address long-term issues. The focus remained squarely on immediate concerns, like the combat effectiveness of small units, while neglecting fundamental systemic challenges such as leadership, command structure, professionalism, and the fight against corruption. Compounding these challenges was the difficulty in accurately assessing the Vietnamese Army's progress, as there wasn't a standard system for evaluating the morale and effectiveness of their units. Although advisors made efforts to navigate these obstacles, they worked in obscurity, overshadowed by the primary focus of U.S. efforts on the larger battle against the VC and NVA. For the South Vietnamese forces, the situation remained dire, plagued by insufficient training. Increased enemy actions made it nearly impossible to withdraw troops for necessary training. Leadership issues and corruption persisted, alongside a decline in combat readiness due to high desertion rates. Attempts to enhance leadership yielded only limited success. One senior U.S. advisor remarked that the South Vietnamese officer corps appeared to lack aggressiveness, leadership skills, and a true commitment to their roles. In 1968, the Communists initiated the Tet Offensive, catching everyone off guard. Chaos erupted across South Vietnam. Once the Allied forces recovered from the shock, they mounted an effective response, and the Viet Cong faced severe setbacks as fighting continued into the fall of that year. To the surprise of many, the ARVN, despite its long-standing issues, held its ground and, in most instances, performed notably well. While the Tet Offensive resulted in tactical setbacks, it became a significant psychological win for Hanoi and effectively ended Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency. In November 1968, Richard Nixon secured the presidential election and, upon his arrival in office, embarked on a strategy he termed peace with honor. This strategy consisted of four key components: Vietnamization, which shifted the war's responsibilities to the South Vietnamese, a renewed focus on pacification, the withdrawal of U.S. troops, and secret negotiations led by Henry Kissinger with North Vietnamese officials in Paris. The announcement of Vietnamization in June 1969 marked the beginning of the fifth and final phase of U.S. advisory efforts in Vietnam. Over the next 4 years, MAP-V gradually shifted its focus from large-scale U.S. combat operations to activities aimed at enhancing the South Vietnamese's capacity to take over the war as American forces were slowly withdrawn. This time saw a heightened mobilization effort in South Vietnam, driving an expansion of territorial security forces and the growth and modernization of regular South Vietnamese forces, placing even greater demands on U.S. training missions. The shift in war responsibility to the South Vietnamese posed a significant challenge for General Creighton Abrams, who had taken over from General Westmoreland as MAF-V commander. He had the daunting task of boosting the combat effectiveness of South Vietnamese forces while still engaged in the conflict, even as the support needed for the Vietnamization process and the advisory corps was facing regular downsizing. Although training the Vietnamese was considered a high priority in theory throughout the war, in practice, it had not received adequate attention since the deployment of U.S. ground troops. With Vietnamization underway, orders came to transfer combat responsibilities to the RVNAF, leading MAC-V to refocus on enhancing training and advisory efforts. As troops were pulled back, the number of advisors assigned to train the South Vietnamese surged significantly. In 1969, the overall strength of the field advisory training teams rose from approximately 7,000 to 11,900, and then again to 14,332 in 1970. With this increase, more advisors were embedded in the Civil Operations and Rural Development Support, or CORDS, initiative focused on pacification, tasked with training the regional and popular forces. With the departure of U.S. troops, these forces had to take on greater responsibility for local security, while the ARVN handled the combat against the PAVN and the remaining VC main force units. Not only did the CORDS effort and combat units see a rise in advisors, but there was also a notable boost in the number of advisors sent to work with the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces Training Base to enhance the quality of training for the South Vietnamese forces. By the close of 1972, the RVNAF was poised to become the largest and most advanced military force in Southeast Asia. Yet, even the best equipment in the world holds no value if soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen lack the knowledge, leadership, and motivation to effectively use it against the enemy. Despite the new policies in place, enhancing South Vietnamese training remained a challenging endeavor. At the start of 1968, the ARVN training system comprised 56 various types of training centers. This included 9 national training centers, excluding the Airborne and Marines, who maintained their own. The MAS-CV, through its training directorate, offered U.S. advisors at RVNAF schools and training facilities, assisting RVNAF leaders in crafting and executing training programs. As previously mentioned, Vietnamization began in 1969. The first real challenge for the South Vietnamese forces arose in the spring of 1970, when 50,000 South Vietnamese troops joined 30,000 U.S. troops in the invasion of Cambodia. During this operation, the South Vietnamese, alongside their American advisors and fighting alongside U.S. forces, performed admirably. However, in the subsequent significant challenge in 1971, the South Vietnamese did not fare as well. In February of that year, President Nixon and South Vietnamese President Thieu dispatched 17,000 South Vietnamese troops into Laos toward Chaphon, along Highway 9 aimed at enemy bases and key locations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This marked the first significant test of Vietnamization, as South Vietnamese troops would engage on their own without U.S. ground forces or American advisors alongside them. The operation began fairly well, but the North Vietnamese quickly retaliated, deploying 4 divisions against the 1st ARVN Corps. By April, the South Vietnamese were retreating back into their territory in chaos. Despite President Nixon's claims of Vietnamization being a success, the ARVN's performance in Lam Son 719 showed that much work remained. Encouraged by the situation in Laos, the military committee in Hanoi decided to go all out. On Good Friday, March 30, 1972, the NVA launched a large-scale, 3-pronged assault, sending 130,000 troops to attack Quang Tri in the north, Con Tum in the Central Highlands, and An Loc, merely 65 miles from Saigon. This offensive was marked by intense conventional warfare, featuring tanks, SA-7 Strela heat-seeking missiles, and various advanced weapons sourced from China and the Soviet Union. The fighting was fierce, resulting in the NVA capturing Quang Tri. However, ultimately, the South Vietnamese forces, supported by their American advisors and a significant U.S. air campaign, managed to hold Kon Tum and An Loc against repeated assaults and even reclaim Tri by September of that year. Nixon had the victory he sought and subsequently declared Vietnamization a significant triumph, providing him with justification for the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam. To summarize, in early 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, resulting in the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops by March 31st. Nonetheless, the war was far from over for the Vietnamese, as it continued to rage for another 2 years. The South Vietnamese, lacking the promised support from President Nixon, who would depart office in disgrace, managed to maintain their ground throughout 1973 and into 1974, but then everything fell apart. When the North Vietnamese launched their final major offensive in March 1975, the South Vietnamese simply did not have the resources or resolve to overcome the enemy, collapsing in just 55 days. In the end, it wasn't the insurgency that brought down the Republic of Vietnam. Rather, it was the Pa Van main forces conducting conventional operations that led to the fall of Saigon. It's true that the United States carries a significant portion of the blame for the final outcome because it didn't deliver the promised military support. However, the South Vietnamese forces also fell short when the North Vietnamese intensified their attacks. Considering the substantial resources, lives, and effort the U.S. put into building effective local forces in South Vietnam, it raises a crucial question: what went wrong? There were some notable successes in the U.S. mission, as evidenced by the growth of South Vietnamese forces from 150,000 in 1956 to over 1 million in uniform by 1973. As mentioned earlier, the South Vietnamese managed to hold on for a while after U.S. troops left, but ultimately, they fell to the final North Vietnamese offensive. So, why did the armed forces of the Republic of Vietnam struggle so badly in 1975? To answer this, we need to look back to the very beginning. The first major error was the incorrect evaluation of the threats facing the Republic of Vietnam during the mid to late 1950s. This led to South Vietnamese forces being organized and trained for the wrong kind of war at an inopportune time. Ultimately, their military proved inadequate for both counterinsurgency efforts and traditional combat. During the early conflict period, when it was mainly an internal insurgency, U.S. training often missed the mark and was largely ineffective. The U.S. military was slow to prioritize genuine counterinsurgency operations that combined both military and political strategies, instead focusing on conventional infantry tactics for the South Vietnamese. Timely and accurate intelligence about the enemy in the early stages would have at least offered the U.S. a chance to set the right priorities in supporting the South Vietnamese military against the actual threat they faced. Adding to this issue was the fact that from the outset, U.S. government agencies in both Washington and Saigon were neither well organized nor sufficiently coordinated to manage the extensive, sensitive, and interconnected programs needed in Vietnam. As a result, when a unified approach was essential to tackle the insurgency, there was no such cohesion. This lack of unity often led to conflicting efforts within the U.S. military, undermining the overall strategy. The more capable military of South Vietnam and the American civilians involved in nation building. This scenario significantly harmed the security conditions in rural areas, but true coordination wouldn't be addressed until CORDS was formed in 1967. The training initiatives struggled due to a lack of direction. When U.S. combat troops were deployed in 1965, supporting the South Vietnamese forces became a secondary priority, leading to a shortage of resources. The ARVN took on pacification security tasks while U.S. units engaged directly with the Viet Cong and the PAVN. With the onset of Vietnamization in 1969, attention shifted back to enhancing the South Vietnamese military capabilities, but it was largely too late. Additionally, the focus leaned more toward combat operations rather than training. As South Vietnamese forces took on greater wartime responsibilities, they found themselves spending more time in active combat and less in training sessions. The toll of war drained the South Vietnamese forces, especially during major operations in Cambodia in 1970, Laos in 1971, and the 1972 North Vietnamese Easter Offensive. There were ongoing issues with the Americans responsible for boosting the combat abilities of the South Vietnamese military. Establishing a robust and effective advisory system requires choosing and training the right people to meet the unique needs of the advisory role. Not everyone possesses the training, experience, maturity, and temperament to be a good advisor. Selecting the right officers and non-commissioned officers for these advisory roles must be a deliberate process. In a 1965 RAND study, Gerald C. Hickey outlined what makes an effective advisor: professional competence, adaptability to different cultures, the ability to collaborate with foreign nationals, and language proficiency. He also suggested that advisors should be volunteers. He emphasized that the skills for effective interaction with foreign nationals can only be partially taught. After selecting the appropriate individuals, it's vital to implement a thorough training program focused on preparing them for their advisory duties. An advisor must be aware of the cultural barriers they need to navigate, whether they are in Vietnam or Afghanistan. Training should focus on the cultural elements that are least familiar to the advisor, including local customs, traditions, history, religion, ethnic backgrounds, and government structures. This was not always recognized during the U.S. efforts in Vietnam, and as a result, the training initiatives were impacted negatively. Time is of the essence, directly influencing how effective the training mission is with local forces. In Vietnam, the U.S. discovered that the advisor's one-year deployment, which started out at 11 months, often hindered the advisor's overall effectiveness. A 12-month period was simply not long enough to establish the rapport and trust essential for enhancing the advised unit over time. Advisors should have longer tours to ensure they have the necessary time to complete their tasks effectively and maintain continuity. Time also plays a critical role at the strategic level. While Vietnam had an existing army, the advisory process aimed at strengthening the ARVN required a significant investment of time to show any advancement. When advising another nation's defense forces, the United States and its army must be ready to commit for the long haul if they hope to address the ongoing challenges of building capable indigenous forces. All these factors are paramount, but two stand out as particularly influential. It's essential to acknowledge the role of the South Vietnamese in this endeavor. In Vietnam, the foundation on which the South Vietnamese armed forces were built, the VNA, was fundamentally flawed. As previously noted, the Republic of Vietnam's forces suffered from a severe lack of leadership across all levels, especially among senior officers. Those in charge failed to appreciate the critical importance of training, which led to a continuous cycle of inadequate training and poor combat effectiveness. U.S. training advisors showcased their expertise in imparting technical skills to foreign personnel and units. They faced significant challenges when it came to providing advice on political and military matters, primarily due to a lack of experience, training, and education. One of the most glaring shortcomings was their failure to establish a robust and dependable leadership structure within the ARVN. As highlighted in a post-war report, the conditions surrounding the social framework, the politicization of the military, and the backgrounds of military leaders indicated that the chances of successfully building effective South Vietnamese military forces were bleak. Another crucial factor contributing to the ultimate failure of the U.S. training mission was the deliberate choice to model the South Vietnamese forces after U.S. troops. This instinct to shape an emerging nation in one's own likeness is understandable, but if the foundational assumptions turn out to be flawed during the conflict, changing course becomes extremely difficult. Adopting American strategies to shape and prepare the South Vietnamese forces failed to consider Vietnamese culture and their unique approach to warfare, which in turn affected how well the South Vietnamese received and acted on the advice given to them. Additionally, trying to create the ARVN in the American mold had long-term detrimental effects. By promoting the American method of warfare, the ARVN became reliant on high levels of costly and advanced American combat assistance, with an excessive reliance on technology and firepower. When that support was removed in 1973, the South Vietnamese were unable to endure the relentless assault from the Pa Thanh during the North Vietnamese final push. As noted by one observer in the aftermath, by 1975, the ARVN had essentially forgotten how to walk and could no longer afford to ride or fly. This situation ultimately led to a crushing defeat for the ARVN in battle and the end of the Republic of Vietnam as an independent nation. In summary, there are numerous lessons to be learned from the American training mission in Vietnam that could inform current training efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The experience in Vietnam starkly illustrates that external assistance and recommendations, especially when rooted in misunderstandings, cannot equip a client state with the necessary leadership, resolve, and unity required to combat a deeply ingrained and sophisticated insurgency. The ability to instill these qualities in the South Vietnamese was simply beyond the capability of U.S. forces, a sufficiently strong sense of morale and determination to ultimately succeed. U.S. combat troops could keep the Viet Cong and PAVN at a distance, but their presence wasn't permanent. T.E. Lawrence captured this idea well when he spoke about training local forces. Better they do it imperfectly than you do it perfectly, for it is their country, their war, and your time is limited. This lesson became painfully obvious during America's time in Vietnam, and it remains relevant today.